Francis Collins is here. He is a physician and a scientist and director of the National Human Genome Research Institute. He completed the first maps of the human genetic code in the year 2000. During his career, he has also helped to discover the genetic misspellings that cause cystic fibrosis, neurofibromatosis, and Huntington's disease. His new book takes a personal look at his religious life. It is called The Language of God. A scientist presents evidence for belief. I am pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome back.
Wonderful to be here at your table, Charlie.
Why did you write this book?
I've been trying to write this book for about 25 years since I became a believer, and I was not raised in a faith tradition, so this is something that occurred to me in my 20s.
Your parents were not believers?
They were not.
Yeah.
They were respectful of religious perspectives, but they did not themselves share those perspectives. So I was raised in a household where faith was not really part of the discussion around the dinner table.
You had a religious experience when you were in the woods somewhere?
It was a little longer of sort of getting to that point. Let me explain. So again, I was not raised in a household where faith was practiced. So when I went to college and we had those discussions one has late at night in the dorm about, you know, what do you believe? I pretty much decided I didn't believe any of it. Yeah. And I slipped from being an agnostic to ultimately an atheist when I was in graduate school. Everything, as far as I was concerned, could be described by mathematics, physics, and chemistry, and there wasn't anything else.
And if you couldn't prove it, it didn't exist.
Exactly. And I was very comfortable with that because it meant that I wasn't really responsible to anyone but me, and I kind of liked that part too. I got to medical school. I continued that view until I got to the point of being taking care of patients, which one does about the third year. And many of these good North Carolina people were afflicted with terrible diseases that they'd done nothing to bring down on themselves. And yet the rock that they stood upon was their faith. And that puzzled me.
They were serene in facing death?
Absolutely.
Serene in dealing with pain and suffering?
Absolutely.
Because they believed in a God.
They believed in a God, and they believed that there was more to what was going on than what you could see, and that they were preparing themselves for a better world.
And you said, I want some of that, or what?
I was puzzled and a little threatened by that. And one afternoon, an elderly woman who had terrible heart disease, who had been talking about her faith, sharing it very openly with me, looked me straight in the eye, and she said, "What do you believe?" And I was unprepared for that kind of question, and I stammered and stuttered and said, "Well, I don't really know." And I felt extremely uncomfortable. My atheism suddenly seemed very thin. And I realized I'm a scientist at that point. I had a PhD. I was supposed to, you know, draw conclusions based on the facts, the evidence. And I'd never really considered the evidence because I didn't know if there would be any. So I began to read what the descriptions were of the various major faiths of the world, and frankly, I didn't understand a bit of it. It didn't make sense to me. I went to visit with a minister who lived down the road in Carrboro, and I asked him a bunch of blasphemous questions, and he took down from his shelf a little book, and he said, "You know, this is written by an Oxford scholar who kind of traveled the same path you did. He was an atheist." It was C.S. Lewis. You got it. And the book was Mere Christianity. Yeah. And as I opened that book,
converted a lot of people.
It has indeed, and with good reason, because here is an intensely logical person who knows atheism because it was his perspective for the first half of his life, and who goes through the arguments, how rational, logical thinking leads you not to the conclusion that there can be no God, but that the existence of God is much more plausible. Not that you can argue yourself all the way to the point of saying, I believe. But you can certainly get to the point of saying it would be more rational for me to consider God as real than to say he could not exist.
So what do you feel about, say, Darwinian evolution as applies to humans?
Well, many people have asked me, you're a geneticist and you're a believer?
Right.
I mean, isn't your head exploding on any given afternoon?
Do you make some giant exception for human beings?
Not at all. So I believe that evolution is absolutely the way in which living things are connected to each other, that all living things are descended from a common ancestor, that Darwin was right, that the process of natural selection operating on mutation resulted in this gradual change and development of species, including ourselves. But that answers how it happened. It doesn't answer why. So I believe that God, who had an intention of creating beings like you and me, with whom he could have fellowship, and who would seek to know him, and he could know us, used the mechanism of evolution to carry out that eventual goal.
Meaning that, as someone said, he wound up the clock and let it go?
In a sense, yes, but not in a deistic sort of sense where he wound up the clock and then wandered off somewhere else without really being too concerned about the consequences. One of the things that I found most compelling in Lewis is the argument about the moral law, the sense that we all have within us about what is good and what is evil, which is true of all cultures down through history. Where does that come from? Evolution, I'm sorry, cannot completely explain that because it calls us sometimes to do things that are destructive for our possibility of passing on our DNA, and that's really all that evolution cares about. If I'm walking down the bank of the river and I see a man drowning, and it's my worst enemy, there is still something within me that tells me I should try to save that person. Evolution would not tell me to do that. So where is this moral?
Does molecular biology tell you to do that?
No, I don't think it does.
What does?
Well, this is where I think the spiritual world becomes more real. When you start thinking about concepts like the moral law, like our universal hunger to look for something outside of ourselves. As Lewis says, hunger is generally attached to something that could satisfy that hunger. Again, I cannot prove faith to you on these grounds, but for me, they're signposts pointing to something greater than ourselves, something good and holy.
Take a look at this. Two of my favorite scientists, in addition to you, at this table. James Watson, Nobel laureate.
Yes.
E.O. Wilson.
Yes.
Pulitzer Prize winner. Here it is.
How have people come to reconcile religion and evolution?
Well, I think you've got to define religion. If it's a personal God who interferes with our lives and listens to our prayers and can aware of our existence, I can only mention one person that I know who believes that, who's a serious scientist. Once you see...
Only one serious scientist you know believes there is a personal God who listens to our prayers.
Yeah, that's about it.
I don't know one.
Well, you know...
I know who you're talking about. Well, I guess I know him, yeah. Okay.
Francis Collins.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's often, Francis Collins is often quoted. And
Yeah, but I really don't know anyone else. And I think when you... Now that we've carried it forward, so we actually look at DNA and see what it's like in the chimpanzee, and you see all these things, and the thought of anyone interfering, oh boy, it just it seems wacko.
so there it is. Jim Watson, Nobel laureate, one of the most important scientific discoveries of our time, says that anybody who believes what you believe, and you're a scientist, serious scientist, he said, a little bit wacko.
Well, I thought that was a pretty amusing clip because it seems also that Jim Watson and E.O. Wilson haven't been getting out very much in the sense that they don't
There are
seem
other scientists believe what you believe.
Yes.
There are even groups of evangelical scientists.
I'm going to a meeting in 10 days of hundreds of them who are absolutely rock-solid Christian believers, but who are also practicing scientists in a variety of disciplines, and darn good ones at that.
Well, have you felt any pushback in terms of scientists saying, well, if this guy believes this, maybe he's not the scientist we thought he was or something?
Not particularly. I think most people are pretty respectful of your religious views, but it makes generally for uncomfortable scientific discussions. If you bring up religion in a scientific meeting, you can clear the room faster than anything else you could imagine discussing. It's just sort of an unwritten taboo. You feel like somebody's saying, didn't you get the memo? We're not supposed to talk about that. But isn't that sad, Charlie?
It is, of course it is. Especially in a world that believes that everybody ought to, the scientific is about everybody having an opportunity to say what they believe and having it tested.
And aren't we in
debate.
Academia supposed to be searching for truth?
Yes.
And there are various ways to search for truth. Science is the way to search for truth about the natural world. But if you're looking for truth about the spiritual world, science is the wrong set of tools. It's not going to get you there. You need there to understand the tools of the Spirit.
But is what gets you there faith? Is that it?
Ultimately, it leads you to faith. But let me say, I think this notion that faith is somehow the antithesis of reason is completely wrong.
Explain why.
So faith is, in fact, the most rational of all choices when you sort of look at the spectrum between atheism and belief. Let me tell you why. Imagine this table represents all of the knowledge that ever has existed or will exist in the universe. A lot of stuff.
Right.
And then ask any individual, where in that table is your own personal knowledge right now? And even the most confident of us will draw a tiny little circle. Now, suppose the knowledge of the existence of God is outside your tiny little circle. How then could anybody who's not a wacko say, I know there is no God? Is that not the most irrational position? Does that not require the greatest faith of all?